e4, c5, knight c3, knight c6, knight f3, g6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, bishop c4, Sicilian. Castle kingside, Sicilian defense, knight c6 variation, accelerated dragon, modern variation with bishop c4, opening line. Bishop b3, Sicilian defense, knight c6 variation, accelerated dragon, modern variation with bishop c4, opening line. Queen a5, out of opening book, d6, would have been in the Sicilian defense, knight c6 variation, accelerated dragon, modern variation with bishop c4, book opening. Pins white's knight at c3, f3, e6. Castle kingside, freeze white's knight at c3 from the pin. d5. E takes d5, threatens black's knight at c6. E takes d5. Protects black's knight at c6. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Queen d2. Rook e8. Rook a d1. Bishop d7. Knight takes c6. Attacks black's queen. B takes c6. Removes the threat on black's queen. Knight takes d5, threatens black's queen and isolates black's pawn at c6. Queen takes d2. Knight takes f6, check. Skewers black's queen, forks black's king and black's rook at e8 and blocks black's pawn at f7. Bishop takes f6, removes the threat on black's rook at e8 and black's king and forks white's bishop at e3 and white's pawn at b2. Bishop takes d2. Bishop takes b2, isolates white's pawn at a2 and white's pawn at c2. Bishop c3, forks black's bishop at b2 and black's bishop at d7. Bishop takes c3, blocks white's pawn at c2. Rook takes d7. White wins a queen, a bishop, 2 knights, and a pawn, for a queen, a bishop, 2 knights, and a pawn. Material is even. Rook f8. Rook f d1. King g7. Rook b7. Bishop a5. Rook d7. Bishop b6, check. Checks white's king. King f1. Moves it out of check. Rook a d8. Rook takes d8. Rook takes d8. Rook takes f7, check. Checks black's king. White wins a rook and a pawn for a rook. White is up a pawn in material. King h8. Moves it out of check. King e2. Rook e8, check. Checks white's king. King d3. Moves it out of check. Rook d8 check, checks white's king. King c3, moves it out of check. Bishop a5 check, checks white's king. King b2, moves it out of check and threatens black's pawn at a7. Bishop b6, protects black's pawn at a7. g4. Rook d2, pins white's pawn at c2 and attacks white's pawn at h2. h4, moves it to safety. Rook h2, threatens white's pawn at h4. Bishop a4, threatens black's pawn at c6. h5. G takes h5, attacks black's pawn at g6 and isolates black's pawn at g6. Rook takes h4, attacks white's bishop. Bishop takes c6, creates a passed pawn on c2. G takes h5, creates a passed pawn on h5. Black wins 2 pawns for 2 pawns. White is up a pawn in material. Bishop e4. Rook h1. f4. Attacks black's rook and pushes the passed pawn. Rook h3. Moves it to safety. c3. Pushes the passed pawn. h4. Pushes the passed pawn. f5. Advances the passed pawn. Rook e3. Attacks white's bishop. Rook e7. Protects white's bishop. Bishop a5. c4. Pushes the passed pawn. h3. Pushes the passed pawn. Rook e6. Frees white's bishop from the pin. h2. Adds a promote threat at h2. Bishop d5. Attacks black's rook. Rook takes e6. F takes e6. Advances the passed pawn. White wins a rook for a rook. White is ahead by a pawn in material. Bishop d8. King b3. King g7. King b4. King f6. King b5. h1, queen. Slightly better is king e7. Bishop takes h1. King takes e6. Black wins a pawn. White is ahead by a pawn. c5. Pushes the passed pawn. King d7. King a6. Attacks black's pawn and blocks black's pawn. King c7. King takes a7. Creates a passed pawn on a2. White wins a pawn. White is up 2 pawns in material. Bishop e7. Attacks white's pawn at c5. c6. Moves it to safety and advances the passed pawn. Bishop c5 check. Checks white's king. The game ends in a draw.